Now on for a long overdue homage to the unsung creator of a cartoon that for nearly a quarter of a century captivated the world, Otto Messmer and Felix the Cat.
Felix the Cat was the first cartoon superstar. At the height of his fame in the mid-1920s, he was as popular with movie audiences around the world as Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. The reason for his great success was that Felix was the first cartoon to express an individual personality in drawings that move. Felix was able to think, to reason, to solve problems, and to communicate his ideas and desires to audiences. He displayed a wild disregard for reality, and he had vitality and an inventiveness that had often eluded American animated cartoons, derived as they were from the static comic strips in newspapers. Felix the Cat became an immediate success after his first appearance in 1919, and producer Pat Sullivan claimed for himself all the credit for the creation and development of the character. While Sullivan did produce the films and did promote Felix to worldwide fame and fortune, the true genius behind Felix the Cat was a shy artist named Otto Messmer.
In those days, a lot of attempts we made to do things, a lot of the concerns would say, that's impossible, it can't be done, you know. Cat can't take his tail or tip his ears like a hat or walk like a human being. But I did that. I sort of defied it and tried it, and the audience roared at it, and I kept it up. Most of the artists were looking more at the art form of the motion, you know. And I thought I would concentrate more on the gags, short visual gags, instead of, you know, extreme animation. Most of the others, as I said before, were striving too much for animation in those early days, you know. But I used to go to the theater and listen. And if I saw things that made people laugh, this was the course to follow.
A critic wrote in 1928, "Felix has escaped the reality of the cat. He is made up of an extraordinary personality. When he is not surrounded by the fantastic, he creates it." The late Pat Sullivan was a hard-drinking Australian immigrant who had worked as a lightweight boxer, a movie exhibitor, and a newspaper cartoonist on the New York World. He opened an animation studio with a small staff in New York City in 1915. In 1916, Sullivan hired a 24-year-old cartoonist from New Jersey named Otto Messmer. Sullivan put him to work thinking up gags and animating on a Charlie Chaplin cartoon series. Messmer studied films of Chaplin and photos of his eloquent pantomime, and this study paid off 3 years later when Messmer began to define the personality of Felix the Cat.
Chaplin sent at least 30 or 40 photographs of himself in different poses. He was delighted. Of course, this helped the propagation of his pictures, you see. And he encouraged us and photographed all these photographs, and we copied every little movement that he did. But it was himself, not Felix, you understand? But later on that rubbed off, and we used a lot of that kind of action in Felix. We found out that a funny walk sometimes would get a laugh without a script idea, you see, or the wiggling of the tail and things of that type. But Chaplin had a great influence on us.
It was Messmer, seen on the left here with Sullivan, who created Felix and developed his personality for 14 years. Messmer never received public recognition for his work until recently, and he never shared in the enormous financial profits that Sullivan enjoyed from Felix. At his home in New Jersey, Otto Messmer, now 84, talks about how Felix came to be.
Well, the Sullivan studio was very busy, and Paramount needed, they were falling behind their schedule, and they needed one extra to fill in. And Sullivan, being very busy, said, if you want to do it on the side, you can do any little thing to satisfy them. So I figured a cat would be about the simplest. Make them all black, you know, you wouldn't need to worry about outlines. And little chasing a mouse around. But one gag after the other, you know, cute. And they all got laughs. So Paramount liked it, so they ordered a series, one a month. Well, the first ones, he was more angular, more like a dog, you know what I mean? But we found out, you know, there's a little difficulty when you start moving these angles. Rounding out was easier, you know, a ball was easier to turn, for instance, than a box or an angle, see? It's much smoother and easier to look at when it's round, you know? Mr. King of Paramount Magazine, we used to call it Feline Follies up to that point. And he figured it ought to have a name. So he suggested if we would care to give it the name of Felix, which we kicked around a little bit and decided this was it, meaning feline and felicity. Good luck, cat.
One of Felix's most famous characteristics was his pacing back and forth while thinking.
Impatience, you know, walking up and down, looking for a solution to something. Well, he represents the thoughts of any child, you know, who's wondering and what things are all about, you know, what's up in the sky, under the sea, and so forth. And these little eye motions indicated how he was thinking. With the frowns and puzzle look and the eyes from side to side until, you know, a kind of a light over his head would give him the solution to the problem. Well, I went to the extremes there. He would leap in the air and flip his legs and twirl around and sort of a little dance, you know. Especially Mark used it often for a hook and exclamation point for a ball and a bat.
Felix became a star. It has been estimated that over 3/4 of the world's population either saw Felix the Cat on the screen or knew him by name. His hundreds of film shorts were the keystone of a million-dollar industry of toys, mascots, comic strips, phonograph records, sheet music, and advertising that anticipated Walt Disney's later success in marketing his fantasies. Pat Sullivan had the character copyrighted, and so he reaped the benefits of Felix's popularity, fame, and money.
It's produced under the name of by Pat Sullivan. You know, that means the studio. Very few people in those days got credit. Most people in the industry knew that I was running the studio for him, but the public, all they got was by Sullivan, see?
Al Euchster, a veteran animator who has worked for both Max Fleischer and Walt Disney, began his long career in 1925 at the age of 16 at the Sullivan Studio. He was hired by Otto Messmer.
Otto Messmer was, well, I would sort of, you know, he was sort of Mr. Felix the Cat himself, you know, synonymous with Felix. And he was a director. And although I don't think we had that formal label at that time, but he directed the film and handed out the work to the animators. And of course, at that time, I wasn't an animator. I was a blackner, put the black on Felix. And of course, today, the process is a little bit different. Pat Sullivan himself, I didn't see too much of. He'd come in occasionally, and then he would go into his office. He had his private office. So I didn't see too much of him. I don't think Pat was involved creatively. So Otto would make up the ideas, you know, create the ideas. And I wasn't ever conscious of a script flying around the studio. Everything just sort of came out of Otto's head. Besides all this creativity, I think every Friday, Otto would go to the bank and pick up the payroll.
Well, I conceived the idea for most of them, and gags, and when we grew to educational films, which was the big one. See, previous to that, we had been doing it for Margaret Winkler. And I could handle that alone, see, with just maybe one assistant and a couple of young fellows to blacken in. But when educational films, that was the big one. One every 2 weeks, we had to get aid, you know, like Al Euchster and Kanata, some young fellows starting, and an occasional guest animator.
He would give out the scenes to the animator, and they would animate. Then the animator, of course, in turn would bring the scene back and flip the drawings, and Otto would give his okay or suggest any changes.
We had a sort of a casual way of sitting around. I didn't sit at a big pompous desk pointing, but we just sat around discussing and making little small sketches and decided it that way.
And I don't know how he got all these things done, because just animation in itself is quite an undertaking. So he did the animation, and evidently while Otto was animating, I always got the impression he was thinking of ideas on another picture coming up, you know.
A seafood restaurant stands today at the site of the old Felix the Cat studio near the corner of Broadway and 63rd Street in New York City. In a long room on the second floor, about a dozen men animated Felix to life.
This is a picture of Pat Sullivan studio. Now, you can see the length of it, and it goes once again as far behind that cabinet in the rear. To the left is Sullivan's offices, his executive offices. But he moved in on this picture which was my desk there, just, because it's a Sullivan studio. Well, anyway, we're in rotation as Pat Sullivan, myself, as Raoul Barry, Dana Parker, Al Euxter,
Hal Walker.
Hal Walker.
Yeah, and then
Al Euxter,
Jack Bogle,
Jack Bogle, George Canada,
Charlie Byrne, and Mr. Thurber.
Mr. Thurber, the cameraman.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and some of the blackness and inkers, when you fellows were getting the animation ready for us,
yes,
and preparing it so we could ink it.
Right.
And while we were waiting for work, we would go in the back there, in that back area, and we'd play a form of baseball with a mailing tube, and then a wad of paper, and then we would hit the wad of paper with the mailing tube. And that would go flying over the partition here.
Right.
And I think one time it landed on Mr. Thurber's camera, his field. And we still like to think that he photographed that wad of paper, but we weren't sure.
After Educational started releasing 2 a month, it sort of got very popular. And he running also in the Sunday pages and daily strips, and tremendous toys, royalties, and books. He kind of took it easy, with his chauffeur and car, and we very seldom saw him. And so he said, why change? We tried several times to suggest that he expand, which the market was there. But he said, why change? It's doing okay now. And that was his attitude. And that's why we didn't get into sound or color or any of those things. Sullivan had a chauffeur and a big, I think it was a Lincoln or Cadillac or something. And the chauffeur had brought Mr. Sullivan home to our apartment in the Willard Hotel. And she told him to wait, and she would let him know if she needs him anymore. So after a while, she leaned out the window to tell him to go back to the garage. She didn't need him anymore, instead of through the bellboy. And she leaned out too far, because it was straight down, the 12th floor. She leaned out too far and tried to get his attention. And she fell out the window, and that was it. Well, this didn't help him any, and, he kind of broke him up a bit, and it didn't help his drinking problem either, and so we hardly ever saw him in the studio. We just kept on. We were at the point of finishing a contract, one series. And already I think the contract was over, we were dickering, or he was dickering for renewal with some other company. And in the meantime, he died. Now, if we had had an unfinished series, we could have continued on to finish that, see, but his lawyer just closed the studio, I had no authority being a salaried man under him, and I didn't own any part of it. I couldn't start a new contract, you see. I could have finished an old one.
Felix fell into oblivion for almost 25 years, and Otto Messmer found work at other New York City animation studios. In In 1959, the revival of Felix the Cat began when veteran animator-producer Joe Oriolo produced 260 new Felix cartoons for television. This sparked interest in the old Felix cartoons, and eventually, because of the reassessment of animation as an art form by film scholars and historians, the truth about Otto Messmer's contributions to that art at last became public.
Well, see, Al, we're making everything in circles nowadays, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
On
it
account of-
simplifies it, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yes,
Figure that out a little bit.
yeah.
Now, way,
Moving.
way back in years, you used to, as you came as a mere child, and you,
which
you
I
used to
was.
blacken in Felix's, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm gonna,
That's
in
right.
retrospect, I'm
Yeah.
gonna hand this back to you
And put the black in.
as your old boss
Yeah,
and
that's
tell you
good.
to blacken it in.
I'll be glad to do that. Let's see now. All right. Yeah, I don't know if I ever told you this, Otto. What I was blackening, you know, I used to draw little cartoons
Yeah, I know.
inside of the area, and then I'd blacken over it,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
see. And that sort of give it a little variety to it. You know, there's a lot of black on these Felixes, too, huh?
Oh,
Yeah, you know. And it did make for a good appearance.
Yes. Well, the black
Yeah.
moves easier on the
Yeah,
eye.
yeah,
If you only
yeah.
have black and white.
Yeah.
Well, we never changed. Disney just was an art form. You know, we had the finest artists in America. In the early days, some of the men, way back in before the World War I, a lot of great artists tried to be animators, you know, but they kept their art too strictly in line with the movement. So, like Winsor McCay, for instance, with the dinosaur, it would take a studio a year to make an animated cartoon. So there were a lot of those artists, and they kind of looked down on you if you made a round ball with a head on it, you know, and a comical figure doing little comical actions. They kind of resented that, but they took a year to make one, because even in the in-between drawings, you know, what the in-betweens are, they made masterpieces, you know. Yeah, I cut out all that nonsense. Of course, we made many characters, little pigs and little dogs and little boys, but this is the one that clicked.